Hello and a very warm welcome to Bharata First. You're watching Big Picture with Frank Rausen Pereira. Since you're here, I would like to thank you for your continued support. For those of you who haven't already subscribed, please subscribe, hit the bell icon, and then all notifications. Do follow our social media handles for all the latest updates, and you can also subscribe to our newsletter to get some incisive, exclusive content. The Bharata First team is running a daily quiz. The winner will get to interview me in a program called Hot Seat. Details are in the description of this video. There is also a contribution link for those who would like to come forward and contribute to keep this content alive. A small step that you take will ensure that we go a long way. To continue to show your love and support. And now, let's begin the discussion. UK Home Secretary Priti Patel has signed off on the order to extradite Nirav Modi, wanted in India on fraud and money laundering charges related to the estimated $2 billion Punjab National Bank scam case. Back on February 25th, the Westminster Magistrates Court had concluded that the diamond merchant has a case to answer before the Indian courts, leaving the sign off on the order with the cabinet minister. Meanwhile, the Indian government has time and again said that fugitive businessmen Vijay Mallya, Nirav Modi and Mehul Choksi will be brought back to India to face the law. The government is pursuing extradition of Vijay Mallya and Nirav Modi from the UK, while Mehul Choksi is believed to be in Antigua and Barbuda. The process, however, is a long and cumbersome one. In this edition of Big Picture, we will analyze the issue of extradition to India. Joining me on the program today are Umu Salma Baba, Center for European Studies, JNU, Anil Trigonayat, former ambassador, and Sangram Patnaik, advocate of the Supreme Court. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Big Picture. Ambassador, let me start the program with you first. There's a lot of talk in the media of late about Nirav Modi's extradition to India. How would you look at that entire process, and what are your thoughts on that?
You see that, as you know, that extradition is a very complicated procedure. And in fact, I have been associated with discussions and negotiating 3 extradition treaties while I was serving in the Ministry of External Affairs. And I have found it, it has been extremely difficult. There are a lot of legal minds. We have the lawyer today. So you will know that every word of the thing provides you a leeway to get out of it, even though there is a great possibility in the larger context, it is all couched as if we are going to serve the justice, or somehow we are going to help the other country, who's a friendly country, by returning the fugitive or the offender from the country. But in the UK especially, and I have been seeing that hardly any extradition has really been effected easily. Firstly, the whole procedure within the country, which is the requesting state, is far too complicated to complete the investigations. And by this stage, you arrive at the letter rogatory, and the External Affairs Minister personally signs the extradition request. It reaches there. We have a treaty with the UK since 1992. And before that, of course, it was governed by their own treaties, 1903 and all that. But I do not see that. This is the first court that has granted Nirav Modi. I think he has 28 days to even go and appeal against it, which is permitted under the law in that country, every country. And they had, of course, seen that Indian jails are not that bad, where a place for him has been placed. They have seen it. But the legal system is such everywhere where they are basically paid to find the faults or loopholes in the system. So they continue to do that. We have seen the case of not only Nirav Modi, but Vijay Mallya, Lalit Modi, and all these fellows and the various island nations, Mehul Choksi sitting in Antigua. The reason is simple, that if the states in the country does not really do its job properly, or the country which is requesting the extradition has not done its job properly, then the case is likely to fall through. But they did it right now because, in my view, because there is a chance that Boris Johnson might be visiting India. So in order to make a little political brownie points, in my view, that they have announced that the first Court of Judge, this has been given that he'll be extradited. At least the Ministry of External Affairs there, of Foreign Affairs, has Foreign Office in the UK, has done its job. Their secretary has said that we are ready to extradite him. But he still has 28 days and he is definitely going to go to the appeal, and let's see what happens then.
Absolutely. You stole the words right out of my mouth. I was just going to come to that, and how much of all of this has to do with Brexit and Boris Johnson's visit. He was supposed to be the chief guest for Republic Day, and now, of course, he wants to visit again. So, Professor Salma Bawa, let me bring you in here. Your thoughts on that particular aspect. How much of this is politics?
I think 90% in law is politics, right? And 10 is then a good lawyer will tell you. As my professor of international law once told me, that if you make a treaty, you have to find a way to break it as well. And all you need is a little devious thinking. Okay, that apart, I think it's a very, very important issue at hand. And obviously for Britain, it's a double whammy. Boris Johnson's trip being postponed once. It's a curtailed trip now happening, most probably next Monday. A very tight agenda, and Britain is working to shore up on the political and economic front, because Brexit has really come as a big blow. Whatever may be the expectations on the ground, it is hitting very hard. And then the COVID has also created a situation which is unprecedented in nature. So I think both of that has now provided an opportunity for New Delhi and London to look at, okay, where they are going to push the foreign policy agenda, right? Because Britain is also willing to expand. It is this global Britain, which is going to be showcased by Boris Johnson. And he's looking at how he can, engage India on this broader trade and investment agreement. And I think the meeting with the Prime Minister, as the ambassador just pointed out, that would be on, but all other meetings, I think, is going to be on a digital mode. So that is going to be one. And intentionality is part of gaining trust. So this is about presenting a new Britain, which is out of the European Union. And as Ambassador correctly pointed out, a few brownie points does not harm. But the law is, long, it's tedious, and the benefit of doubt has to be argued at every point. And that is going to be availed by Nirav Modi as well. So I think my quick point over here is that there is going to be a looking at how can this be a backdrop, but this cannot define a relationship, right? I mean, we have to understand that this one, in the larger point, this is only a footnote. Ultimately, the due diligence was on the Indian side. What happened when the loan was given out? Catching and closing the stable door afterwards is when the story has been done. So I think this is about, resetting and looking at, India, Britain 2030. And there's an attempt at putting all of that with the tilt in the foreign policy, British foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific. We've already seen the Quad exercise take place. So I think we're going to be looking at a heightened agenda in which Britain also wants to be part of the larger Indo-Pacific and the Western Indian Ocean, which is shaping up more currently.
Absolutely. Sangram Patnaik, let me bring you in here. There have been a lot of references made to the legal aspect and how this is everything about the courts and the law and finding some loopholes. From your perspective, let's also understand from a legal perspective, how would you look at this entire Nirav Modi case?
See, the fact of the matter is that there are a number of, discussions or debate. There is a loophole in the system itself, or the people try to interpret in a manner which suits the accused or even the system. But end of the day, personally, I believe, like every person in this world has a right to defend his case. He may win, he may lose, that's a different thing. For example, the judge has the power even to refuse the extradition also, particularly limited to the 4 aspects. It can be, rule of double jeopardy, extraneous consideration, passage of time, human rights. These are the 4 grounds basically on the basis of which the learned judge would have refused the extradition even, well within his power. Maybe on the ground of nationality, religion, gender, race, if he expects that yes, there is a bias. Suppose we, as the legal system in India, have a bias toward some gender or the nationality or the caste or the religion, he can still refuse. Double jeopardy, for example. Even passage of time, suppose that a number of days or the years have been gone by, you would have said that no, we would not extradite him. Or even the human rights aspect. Particularly, he has dealt with in this order itself that he's not finding or she's not finding that there is any human rights violation in India if he is tried in accordance with Indian law. That is a I mean, see, I would say they have a specific art of 2003 on the basis of which everything has, done. And the most important part is that there is the appellate provision also. Suppose he says that he can challenge it. After the Secretary of State gives that permission, he can still challenge it in the High Court. Now, after that also, like you said just now, that Vijay Mallya has that, that why he is not being extradited as yet. Because thereafter, there is a provision to challenge the Supreme Court both on the fact as well as the law. That's another important aspect. It is not only the law, fact and law to the High Court and law to the Supreme Court. So therefore, there are 3 stages. You have to come across the 3 stages, and either the government or the Nirav Modi has to succeed in all 3 stages. He has lost one battle. Now, if he challenges in the High Court, and the High Court both on the fact, suppose the landed judge, this magistrate, Westminster magistrate, is wrong in some aspect of law as well as the fact. Both the aspects can be challenged in the High Court. And secondly, if he loses there also, he has a remedy to go to the Supreme Court even on the question of law, limited aspect, but on the question of law, he can go to the Supreme Court. That takes time. And in Vijay Mallya's case, all 3 avenues have been availed by Vijay Mallya. Then, now it is lying in the Human Rights Commission. Of course, he lost in the Supreme Court. The appeal was not allowed. So all these aspects, if you apply to the Nirav Modi's case, of course it will take time. But I would definitely say at this point of time that law might be having, there is some loopholes, but it is a foolproof method. Nobody should go unpunished if he's really guilty of all those, whatever he's convicted of or the charge has been framed in his court. But he must go through these stages. You cannot suddenly, Indian government would say, see, there is a 7,000 odd crores, Gupap has been done, so therefore he should be convicted. No, he has a right to challenge here also. He has to go through the evidences, cross-examination. He may lose. That's a different thing. But it is too early to say that, no, he should be convicted. He has gone ahead and you have succeeded in one court. He may challenge it. He may not succeed. He may succeed. We have to wait for that day to come.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Ambassador, let me bring you in here and let's broaden the scope of the discussion a little bit and not just look at this from a specific India-UK perspective, but generally as a whole, even other countries find it difficult. This extradition process is extremely tedious. It's extremely difficult. What are some of the biggest challenges really, and what is it that governments look at before they extradite someone?
There are many things that are there when you are discussing, it was mentioned just now that the due process of law and everything has to take place. Now, I tell you, we have also got treaty with 47 countries, not only with the UK, and arrangements with 9 other countries. For example, I'll tell you in the UAE's case, or Saudi Arabia for that matter, when they saw the Indian nationals in the difficult, earlier they were never sending anybody. But since the relationship has improved and they realize that it's not going to serve them any purpose, they expedite the process of sending back people. We have received quite a few of them. And in many cases, extradition procedure itself, if you come to think of it, the whole procedure, whether it is the red corner notice or whether the person is fugitive availed all the legal remedy that is available to him, all these are prescribed in a domestic law of that particular country. But at the same time, they're bound by the legal listing. Why they cannot do, for example, if there's a capital punishment, then very often it may not be extradited. If it is a political offense, they will not expedite or not send person, rather the asylum may be considered in that particular case. So there are many reasons, but in this particular case, we are seeing the financial problems. And these people, those who have gone from here, whether they are illegally, they might get the benefit of doubt or whatever it is for so long, but everybody knows that they have run away from it. If they wanted to undergo the Indian law, to face the Indian law, they could have done it very well here rather than absconding to another third country. So ipso facto, they are accused, and not only accused in the public eye, they might even be the criminals in that sense of the term. With 9,000 crores, Mallya gone and this and that. Now, who said it, who helped him politically and this and that, that nexus is a very different kind of thing. But then there are, if you see the procedure, it is pretty detailed at every step of the way. And that's where we can see that there are going to be, sometimes we don't even have extradition treaties with certain countries, right? Still, they will send the person into the municipal law because they consider that it is quite possible that this person has done something which is grievous to the nation's system. So these are the kind of things that play out. And whether we are a treaty state or non-treaty state, so sometimes we've been successful with non-treaty states, while with the countries like and many countries have a problem that they will never send their own national, right? Many countries, for example, in the Middle East, whenever we sign with them the treaty, it is not possible to send your citizens back. Like, so you have to try them within your own country. So that is another limitation that is prescribed by this. So there are quite a few things I would say in the extradition treaty which we discussed. That's why I say, I mean, once I went to discuss with Bulgaria, it was 33 hours of continuously there in the room. And they brought some very legal luminaries, and we had a big team from the MEA law division also. It was impossible to break the ice. On every word was discussed. So that's what was mentioned earlier here, that this is something that happens. So very often what you can do, you may not have a treaty with a country, but you are, for example, part of another treaty. For example, counterterrorism, transnational crimes, corruption, and all that. So the central government can issue a notification, and both the countries agree, and then this is possible to just extradite under that, even without having the extradition treaty. So I think the intent, as far as UK is concerned, frankly, if you want to read everything, it has become a haven for these kind of financial games everywhere from all over the world. I mean, it has become I think they have to come clean on it. And there are a lot of statistics available which says that billions and billions of dollars are being funded and funneled into it. Their legal system is thriving on these kind of things. They have these islands which are providing refuge to all kinds of people. I mean, so I think the UK in that, personally, I feel is not above board as far as the financial crimes are concerned, even though they might take a refuge under the law of the land or the due process of law.
Sure, absolutely. So, Salma Bawa, let's take this particular aspect forward. Let's also talk about how a criminal is a criminal, whether it is in India, whether it is in Saudi Arabia or the United States. Let's for a second or for 10 seconds believe in that and believe that we live in a utopian world. So, in that kind of a situation, could we come up with some kind of a common minimum understanding so that we can simplify the process of extradition all over the world?
Oh, that's like asking, can everybody get the Nobel Prize this year for all the vaccines?
No, but some common minimum understanding, where you can come to terms that someone is a murderer or someone, something like that, where we can drop something.
See, I think the challenge in law, and we have a legal luminary here, from my understanding, let me put it that way, law comes with different traditions, right? And when we are looking at these traditions and how they've evolved, coming to a common understanding, even like the United Nations Geneva Convention on the Refugees or the UN Human Rights, Convention, all of these have not been easy. India has been part of this, for example. But traditions evolve, and to come to a common understanding requires, it should not lead to a dilution. Because it has to also stand up to scrutiny, as it has been said. So, that is where I believe that you have to make your own laws more robust. You have to look at your own systems in these kind of things than to look at when the horse is bolted away, then how do you kind of make it strong? So coming to a common minimum definition in these kind of areas is also going to be, it's a political issue as well. I mean, can everybody politically agree? We still don't have a political agreement, for example, on terrorism, whereas so many countries around the world have been impacted by it. So I think when you're looking at economic offenses as such as well, law will not come to that kind of a commonality. And I think it may be difficult. What you can do is also try to see how you can, create more robust list of these kind of offenses to say, okay, can we then at a bilateral level or come to some kind of a multilateral, even smaller millilateral agreements which can facilitate. But at the end of the day, all of this, Frank, depends also on political will. So is that really something so important to put at, the UN agenda, for example? That's a very important question to ask. I mean, think for a minute, if I get away from crime, public health was never on the global agenda, right? Till the pandemic hit us. Today, it is the number one global public good we are talking about. And we have been caused most unaware, unprepared for it. So I think putting economic offenses of this nature is then a long call out as far as international law, and getting that kind of a political understanding among all. Because I think at the end of the day, countries like to keep a little bit amount of that political strategic advantage and that space to negotiate. If you have already negotiated everything away, and if the chips are against you diplomatically, then you don't have a space to maneuver. So politics is not about playing always all the cards. And sometimes you may have a bad card, but you have to be very, very strategic. You don't want to negotiate everything and have every line, every I dotted and every T crossed. So I think one has to make distinctions about where law can be, but I think it's also about political intentionality. And I would therefore say the first task begins at home. I think we need to strengthen it to prevent and really put out a strong message that economic offenses, ultimately, if you look at the nature of the crime, it's small investors putting their everyday money and hard-earned money into a bank. And if that money, if for a small time person, if they have to give all kinds of letters of collateral to take money, and a person can go to get the car if the car loan has not been paid up, then think about how political mileage is being used to give loans of this disproportionate nature to big businesses, right? So that also needs to be put on the table. What is it we are creating at the end of the day?
Sure, absolutely. So, Sangram Patnaik, let me bring you in now. Let's talk about some of the biggest challenges really as far as, extradition is concerned from a legal perspective. Where are the stumbling blocks? How do we overcome some of these stumbling blocks?
See, at least today we're discussing that, yes, there are stumbling blocks and it has to be overcome. Earlier, it used to take years together. Now, at least all of us agree with such preliminary figure here. I mean, today in this debate, I must say there can be a loopholes, but we should not blame the system always. We cannot throw the baby with the bathwater. The system is there since ages. What I would definitely like to point out is what is that we are lacking. For example, let me put it straight away, that whether we have the manpower to handle it. Answer is probably no, emphatic no. The kind of, suppose if you compare to the FBI with the CBI, 35,000 to 6,000 officers is nowhere near. The investigation of this magnitude requires a lot of manpower. Second, efficiency level of those officers. Suppose I'm a handwriting expert, there would be at least 10 people should be available on the desk to do that. And once for all. Third, suppose I would say that, yes, the trial should be over by 6 weeks or 8 weeks. Like Learned Ambassador just now pointed out, we sat for 3 days, we couldn't able to, reach to a conclusion. But then, end of the day, I can give another example. Whether we have a translator to explain everything to those, courts, answer is no. That's why I'm saying we are lacking in our own system. We cannot blame suppose there is a treaty in place, but you have to convince the judge there. A district magistrate is sitting there. You have to convince everything, every aspect of law. Section 73, Section 80. I'm not going into the detail of it. What are the offenses? Suppose, for example, criminal breach of trust. Right? Suppose you would say that, yes, there is a criminal conspiracy is there. There is a cheating is there. So you have to actually, when you file the affidavit before the court concerned, you have to take care of so many things. What happens in reality? That it comes back, no, it is not correct. So either you may say it is rejected by the British court, but it is not. British court is not in a position to comprehend what you wanted to say as per your system. Charge is framed under which section? What are the offenses? So all these things need to go into to reach to a conclusion. These are the lacunas. Suppose, the government of India would say today that I would stop here in saying that, yes, it has to be at one go. Every compliance with the affidavit filed at the first instance is to be complete. Generally, it never happens. It is so, goody-goody to discuss here in a debate that, yes, we should complete it in time. But we are lacking in ourselves that we are not fighting to our best capability to produce the results. So therefore, I would definitely say treaty is fine. We have so many countries are there. I would say there is an act here in UK. But there are countries where there is no, act is there. There is only treaty. Do you mean to say that, yes, we have not, you don't follow a system? Yes, answer is yes. But when we file it, when we do that, suppose conviction part, today this judge is convinced that, yes, all these 4 categories is not to be covered in this case. So therefore, it can be extradited to the concerned court here in Delhi or in Bombay to be tried and tested. But why this time? I would say that lawyers have done their part. They have to argue a case. They have to put their case because they have been paid for it. That's a separate part. But whether we are lacking when we present our case, if that is there, we should remove that. That's my short answer.
Okay. All right. Time to get quick closing comments now from all my panelists with the best way forward. Starting first with you, Ambassador.
Well, I only would say that at least as far as two kinds of crimes, in my view, one is like economic offenses, and second is related to murder or terrorism. In those cases, I think that there has to be some kind of global understanding that there should be an expedited. We have this FATF, for example, Financial Action Task Force, under which is also becoming politicized over time. So I mean, it doesn't deliver. And as was mentioned earlier by the professor, that we don't even have a definition of terrorism in the international domain. So we need to that has to be accepted. India has this comprehensive convention on international terrorism. So today, some country can oblige you by returning X, Y, or Z, but he may keep the other ones. Like until recently, several of the Gulf countries refused to send to us, and we always had this problem with Dawood and others. So, but today it has changed. It depends on the political complex of your relationship. But I think as far as these treaties are concerned, everybody applies their mind, does it, and tries to, provide. Supposedly, you are not convicted till you are, proven what guilty. Yes. So you are accused still. So as of now, the Nirav Modi or Malaya or Lalit Modi, they are not accused, and they might get away or they might come back, depends on the kind of pressures. It will be discussed, I'm quite sure. There may be certain ways, and if necessary, we need to agree to change the treaty. We might as well do that. And it is, as far as UK is concerned, I think the UK needs to have a hard look at its own policies where they are allowing these kind of economic offenders. And the statistics proves that it is very financially beneficial to them.
Absolutely. Professor?
So my concluding comment here is, I think, to strengthen domestic law first. Extradition can only be the weapon of last resort. It cannot be your first line of defense. So I think in the coming time, we will see lot more economic brazenness and economic offenses increasing. And in that extent, Britain would also have to look, does it want to be the calling card of the scoundrels? Because, if anybody who's escaping here is going to land up, and as Ambassador just pointed, it makes for good business, but, it is also giving a negative impact. So I think first strengthen domestic law, look at ways and means of, when you have a political opportunity to expand how extradition can take place. But like, it has been pointed out, it is extremely difficult and it's a slippery rope. So which means there are lots of avenues in which the individual can escape, right? And I would think that political intentionality is also important. I think in the larger scheme of things, if you set your own house in order and close the gate over there, then extradition may be less of an instrument to be used diplomatically. Thank you.
Sure. And Sangram Patnaik, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Yes, my take could be, the extradition is a must. It has to be. By the definition in the Black's Law Dictionary, if one goes by, that the fugitive, where he lives, without consent or with consent, he must be extradited. That is the first and foremost thing. But with a sufficient proof of trial, and the process has to be gone into. There is no doubt about it that some court should refuse for this kind of offenses, particularly the economic offenses, right? That is my first take. Second, shortly I would conclude. Second, the moment it is there, suppose for example, there is no treaty with A state or a B country or C country, whether there is a fugitive is living and he has done these offenses here in this country, whether he can be deported, answer to, according to me, is yes. That has to be done, but with a sufficient protection. The accused should not feel that he is not being protected or he is not given any chance. That is the principle of natural justice, to being heard and tried in accordance with law.
All right, we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is extradition is a very difficult and arduous process. There is no common minimum understanding even between nations that we have existing treaties with, as the courts interpret the law differently. There are loopholes that are exploited, and we need to fix them. Crimes like terror and murder needs to have some kind of common ground so that the guilty are punished. Extradition should be a weapon of last resort. What we really need to do is strengthen our own laws so that we don't have to get to this in the first place. Once again, thank you for your continued support. For those of you who haven't already subscribed, please subscribe, hit the bell icon and then all notifications. Do follow our social media handles for all the latest updates, and you can also subscribe to our newsletter to get some exclusive, incisive content. The Bharata First team is running a daily quiz. The winner will get to interview me in a program called Hot Seat. The details are all in the description of this video. There is also a contribution link for those who would like to come forward and contribute to keep this content alive. Remember, a small step that you take will ensure that it is a giant leap for us. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.